In March 1968, Nui Dat Base, South Vietnam, American Green Beret advisors watched Australian SAS soldiers unload their gear for jungle operations. The Aussies carried L1A1 rifles, but something was catastrophically wrong. Sawn-off barrels hacked from 21 inches down to 17. Skeleton stocks where full frames should be. Every metal surface wrapped in cloth tape like field dressings on a dying weapon. To the Americans, these rifles looked butchered, like someone had taken a hacksaw to military equipment in a garage at 2 a.m. "Those idiots are going to get themselves killed," one Green Beret muttered, shaking his head at the spectacle. Within 3 months, those same Green Berets would be begging to learn from those idiots. Because the Australians weren't just modifying their rifles. They were solving a problem that was killing Americans every single day. A problem the U.S. military had thrown $3.7 million and thousands of lives at without success. By early 1968, MSAVSOG, the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, the most classified American unit in Vietnam, had what intelligence officers called the prairie fire problem. Reconnaissance teams were going into the jungle and vanishing. Not from enemy action. From detection. The numbers were brutal. In I Corps, the northernmost military region of South Vietnam, recon teams had an average lifespan of 6 missions before catastrophic contact. Cross-border operations into Laos had a 100% contact rate. Every single patrol was discovered, tracked, and engaged. The statistics that circulated among Special Forces officers were classified for a reason. They were terrifying. Some SOG units had casualty rates exceeding 300% annually. Read that again. 300%. The entire unit turned over 3 times in a year from deaths and wounds. That's not a unit. That's a meat grinder with a flag on it. The problem was simple to describe, impossible to solve. The Viet Cong could hear American patrols coming from hundreds of meters away. It wasn't a lack of training. Green Berets went through some of the most intensive infiltration training in the world. It wasn't lack of courage. SOG operators were among the most decorated soldiers in American history. It wasn't a lack of equipment. The U.S. was deploying experimental people sniffer sensors, infrared detection systems, modified weapons, even early night vision technology. The problem was the jungle itself and how 2 different militaries understood it. American doctrine in 1968 emphasized firepower and communication. A standard SOG recon team carried an N/PRC-25 radio weighing 23 pounds. They carried M16 rifles, 20 inches of barrel, 39 inches overall length. They carried enough ammunition to sustain contact, 400 to 600 rounds per man, plus grenades, smoke, and demo charges. A 6-man team moved through the jungle carrying over 400 pounds of equipment. And the jungle heard every ounce of it. The metallic clink of ammunition pouches. The electronic hiss of radio squelch. The scrape of a 39-inch rifle barrel against bamboo. The snap of branches under boots designed for temperate forests, not tropical undergrowth. Lieutenant Colonel John Singlaub, SOG's chief of operations, later wrote, "We were sending our best men into an environment where they had every disadvantage except courage. The enemy was quieter, lighter, more patient, and above all, invisible. We were loud, heavy, impatient, and obvious. The U.S. military tried everything. They spent millions. They tested technology. They modified tactics. Nothing worked. The VC still heard them coming. Then 120 Australians from 3 Squadron, Special Air Service Regiment, arrived at Nui Dat. And Captain Jim Wallace watched them unload their equipment with growing confusion and contempt. Because what the Australians were carrying didn't just look wrong. It looked suicidal. The briefing room at MACVSOG headquarters in Da Nang was windowless by design. What happened inside stayed inside. On this particular morning in early March 1968, a dozen senior officers sat in folding chairs facing a wall covered in acetate overlays and grease pencil markings. The maps showed operational zones across South Vietnam and into Laos. The numbers written beside each zone told a story that made even hardened commanders shift uncomfortably in their seats. I Corps, the northernmost region, average team lifespan before catastrophic contact, 6 missions. Cross-border operations into Laos, 100% contact rate. Not 95%. Not 98%. 100%. Every single patrol discovered, tracked, engaged. The intelligence officer, a captain with exhausted eyes, moved his pointer across casualty figures that had been classified secret for good reason. Some reconnaissance units were experiencing turnover rates exceeding 300% annually. The entire roster was replaced 3 times over from deaths and wounds. Officers in the room did the math silently. That wasn't combat. That was systematic slaughter with a mission designation. "Gentlemen," the captain said, his voice flat with the weight of what he was presenting, "we are losing the reconnaissance war. Not because our men aren't brave enough, trained enough, or equipped enough. We're losing because the enemy knows we're coming before we know where we're going." The Viet Cong could detect American patrols from hundreds of meters away. In dense jungle where visibility rarely exceeded 30 meters, that advantage was insurmountable. By the time a SOG team realized they'd been compromised, they were already in a pre-sighted kill zone. Lieutenant Colonel John Singlaub, SOG's chief of operations, stood and faced the room. His expression carried the burden of sending men into an environment where courage meant nothing against physics and doctrine. "We are sending our best men into an environment where they have every disadvantage except courage," he said quietly. "The enemy is quieter, lighter, more patient, and above all, invisible. We are loud, heavy, impatient, and obvious." The U.S. military had thrown everything at the problem. $3.7 million on experimental low noise radios that the VC still heard. People sniffer sensors designed to detect ammonia from human perspiration. The jungle was full of ammonia. Infrared detection systems that couldn't penetrate the canopy. Acoustic sensors that picked up everything except useful intelligence. Modified weapons, different boot designs, counter-tracking techniques learned from Native American advisors. The casualty rates barely changed. In quiet conversations after official briefings, some commanders were asking questions that bordered on heresy. Should reconnaissance operations be suspended entirely in certain areas? Was the intelligence gained worth the blood price? The question no one could answer hung in the air like smoke. Why could the Viet Cong move through the jungle like ghosts while American Special Forces, the most elite soldiers in the world, sounded like a marching band? Then, in late March 1968, 120 Australians from 3 Squadron, Special Air Service Regiment, arrived at Nui Dat Base with gear that looked like it had been assembled from a junkyard. Their rifles appeared to have been attacked with hacksaws. Their loadouts were half the weight of American standards. They moved with a deliberate slowness that seemed designed to get them killed. Captain Jim Wallace watched them unload and thought, "We're about to add Commonwealth casualties to our statistics." He had no idea those destroyed weapons were about to save American lives. A standard American reconnaissance patrol moved through the Vietnamese jungle carrying an average of 87 pounds per man. The PRC-25 radio alone weighed 23 pounds, but it was non-negotiable. Communication with extraction helicopters and fire support meant survival. The M16 rifle, 39 inches from buttstock to muzzle, came with 400 to 600 rounds of ammunition distributed across chest pouches and rucksacks. Add grenades, smoke canisters, demolition charges, medical supplies, water, and rations, and every operator became a walking logistics depot. The problem wasn't the weight itself. Special Forces soldiers could carry twice that if necessary. The problem was what all that equipment sounded like in an environment where sound traveled like ripples across still water. The PRC-25 squelch brake registered at 40 decibels, audible to trained ears at 200 meters in a quiet jungle. The 39-inch rifle barrel scraped against bamboo and hanging vines with every step, creating a rhythmic whisper that screamed foreign presence to anyone listening. Metal canteen cups rang against metal canteen bodies. Ammunition in metal link belts clicked like distant typewriters. Deerings on rucksacks tapped against frame bars. The composite signature registered at approximately 35 decibels during normal tactical movement, audible to experienced Viet Cong trackers at 400 meters. And the boots. Standard-issue American jungle boots had aggressive tread patterns designed for temperate forests where fallen leaves and soft earth absorbed impact. In tropical undergrowth, those same treads caught on vegetation, snapped twigs, and announced every footfall like a drumbeat. American doctrine had been built on principles that won World War II and Korea: overwhelming firepower and reliable communication. In the Vietnamese jungle, those principles became liabilities. The emphasis on sustaining firefights meant heavy ammunition loads. The requirement for constant radio contact meant electronic signatures. The belief in technological superiority meant complex equipment that required maintenance, made noise, and added weight. Captain Jim Wallace understood this intellectually, but 3 tours had built an unshakable confidence in American methods. He'd survived situations that killed lesser men because of that radio, that ammunition, that firepower. He knew what worked. So when the Australians arrived at Nui Dat and began unpacking their gear, everything about them seemed fundamentally wrong. Their L1A1 rifles had been mutilated, barrels sawn from 21 inches down to 17, full stocks replaced with skeleton frames that looked like they'd snap under recoil. They carried half the ammunition Americans did, maybe 200 rounds per man. Most patrols had no radios at all. Their boots were canvas and rubber affairs that looked like they'd disintegrate in the first stream crossing. They moved at what Wallace could only describe as a glacial pace, so slowly it seemed deliberate, almost theatrical. Wallace approached an Australian warrant officer named Ronston who was inspecting one of the modified rifles. "The barrel's too short for accuracy," Wallace said, keeping his tone professional but unable to hide the skepticism. "You're losing muzzle velocity, losing effective range." "Why would you do that?" Ston looked up with a slight smile that somehow managed to be friendly and knowing at the same time. "Because we're not here to shoot at targets 300 meters away, mate." His accent was thick, his manner unhurried. "Most of our contacts happen inside 50 meters. Many inside 20. We've optimized for the environment we're actually fighting in, not the environment we wish we were fighting in." Before Wallace could respond, orders came down from MACV headquarters. The Australians had earned their reputation in Malaya and Borneo. They'd been invited as Commonwealth allies and would operate according to their own doctrine. The message was clear: let the Aussies do it their way. They've earned the right to their own methods, even if those methods look suicidal. Wallace watched them prepare for their first patrol, moving with that strange deliberate slowness, and thought, we'll be extracting their bodies within a week. April 15, 1968. The mission was straightforward: locate and identify a suspected Viet Cong base camp in the Hat Dike area, 10 kilometers northeast of Nui Dat. Intelligence suggested a company-sized element operating from a concealed position. 2 patrols would insert from different directions toward the same objective. Whoever found the camp first would call in the other for joint assessment. Python Patrol, an American SOG team, inserted at 0600 hours. 6 men, experienced operators, full combat loads averaging 87 pounds per man. Their call sign reflected their doctrine: strike fast, strike hard. The team leader was a veteran sergeant with 2 tours and a reputation for aggressive patrolling. They moved at the standard tactical pace, 100 meters per hour through dense jungle, security halts every 15 minutes, rotating point man every 30. Captain Wallace monitored from the Tactical Operations Center, watching the map as Python's position updates came through the PRC-25. By 0615, they'd covered 400 meters from the landing zone. Making excellent time, Wallace noted to the radio operator. At this rate, they'd be in the objective area by early afternoon. Ferret Patrol, Australian SAS, inserted 30 minutes later at 0630. 5 men under Sergeant Terry O'Farrell, average load 52 pounds. No radio traffic. Their insertion helicopter reported them moving into the tree line, then nothing but silence. By 0730, Python had advanced another 300 meters. Wallace checked the map and estimated Ferret's position based on their insertion point. If they were moving at American tactical speeds, they should be roughly parallel to Python by now, approaching from a different angle. By 0900, Wallace was confused. Still no radio contact from Ferret. He calculated their movement at standard pace. They should have covered significant ground. They're going to be out there for a week at this rate, he muttered, assuming the Australians were lost or moving even slower than their training exercises suggested. At 1,410 hours, Python triggered an ambush. The after-action report would later reveal that the Viet Cong had been tracking Python for nearly 2 hours, moving parallel through the jungle, setting up a 3-sided kill zone with pre-positioned firing positions. Python's point man died in the first volley. The radio operator took shrapnel from an RPG that detonated 3 meters from his position. The team fought their way out, but extraction came under fire. Final tally: 2 dead, 3 wounded, 0 intelligence on the enemy camp. The area was compromised. The mission was scrubbed. Ferret Patrol heard the contact from 3 kilometers away. They froze in place for 30 minutes, then continued their impossibly slow advance. By 1800 hours, 12 hours after insertion, Ferret was overlooking the Viet Cong base camp. They had approached from an unexpected angle, moving so slowly that they'd actually stepped over a VC sentry trail without the guards hearing them. Sergeant O'Farrell later reported they'd been within 10 meters of an enemy position for over 40 minutes, waiting motionless for a guard rotation before continuing. They observed the camp for 6 hours. Counted structures. Identified weapons positions. Photographed key personnel with a telephoto camera lens through gaps in the canopy. At 0200 hours, they withdrew along their exact approach route, moving backwards for the first 200 meters to avoid creating new tracks. They exited the jungle at 0600 the next morning, 24 hours after insertion, with photographs, detailed intelligence on enemy strength and disposition, and 0 enemy contact. When Wallace saw the intelligence dump, his first reaction was disbelief. There's no way they got that close. The photographs were clear enough to identify individual faces. The structural count matched perfectly with what aerial reconnaissance later confirmed. His second reaction, after the confirmation came through: how the hell did they get that close? What happened next would make Wallace question everything he'd learned in 3 tours. May 6, 1968. Route 328, 2 kilometers north of Binba village. Sergeant Barry Tiny Peters, a nickname that made sense only when you understood Australian irony, as the man stood 6'3", had been tracking a Viet Cong supply column for 16 hours. The column consisted of approximately 40 VC carrying supplies from a cache area to forward positions. Peters and his 5-man patrol, call sign Bravo 2, had identified them at dusk the previous evening. What happened next demonstrated a fundamental difference in military philosophy. American doctrine emphasized immediate action, make contact, call in fire support, exploit with overwhelming force. The Australians did something that baffled their American observers. They paralleled the enemy column throughout the night, never engaging, just tracking. Peters wasn't reacting to where the VC were. He was predicting where they would be. By dawn, Peters had formed a hypothesis. The VC were following a predictable route, resting during daylight hours, moving again at dusk. And they were sloppy, probably local militia, not regular NVA. He positioned his patrol along a likely ambush site and did something no American unit had the doctrinal patience for. He waited. 11 hours. 7 hours into the wait, a bull ant crawled into Peters's boot. Anyone who's encountered Australian bull ants knows they don't just bite, they sting with the persistence of small needles dipped in acid. Peters could feel it working its way up his calf, the pain shooting through his leg in hot pulses. 15 meters away, a VC soldier sat smoking a cigarette, rifle slung across his back, completely unaware he was being watched. Peters didn't move. He let the ant continue its assault. Let the VC soldier finish his cigarette, field strip it with practiced efficiency, scatter the paper, and walk away. Only then did Peters allow himself to shift his rifle position. No sudden movement. No noise. No radio traffic. The Australians had selected their positions so carefully that they didn't need to adjust. They had simply become part of the terrain. At 1,640 hours, the VC column moved into the kill zone. Australian ambush doctrine differed radically from American practice. U.S. ambushes emphasized maximum firepower, claymores, automatic weapons, grenades, everyone firing simultaneously. The goal was devastation in the first 5 seconds, then assault through the kill zone. Peters let the first 10 VC walk past his position. Close enough to touch. Close enough to hear them breathing. Then he and his men opened fire with precision shots, not automatic bursts. The cut-down L1A1 rifles at ranges of 15 to 20 meters were devastating. The heavier 7.62 mm round, even with reduced velocity from the shortened barrel, had far more stopping power than the M16's 5.56 mm. In 8 seconds, Peters and his team killed 14 VC. The remaining column scattered into the jungle. This is where Australian doctrine showed its genius. Instead of pursuing, which meant moving fast, making noise, potentially walking into a counter-ambush, the Australians remained perfectly still. The shortened rifles meant they could track targets while barely moving their bodies. They picked off 6 more VC who made the fatal mistake of thinking the firing had stopped. Total Australian ammunition expenditure, 97 rounds. Total VC casualties, 20 confirmed killed, estimated 8 to 10 wounded. Australian casualties, 0. But the brilliance went deeper. The surviving VC fled in the wrong direction, toward an Australian blocking position that Peters had radioed for before the ambush. Another 8 VC were captured. From first shot to last, 4 minutes. Total VC casualties or captures, 28 out of 40. 3 weeks earlier, an American SOG team had conducted a similar ambush on Route 2, 30 kilometers north. They'd killed 12 enemy but taken 2 casualties when the VC counterattacked. They'd expended over 800 rounds, called in gunship support, and been extracted under fire. The after-action report reached General Creighton Abrams's desk in Saigon within 48 hours. His response was immediate: personally request that Australian SAS provide cross-training to selected American Special Forces units. Captain Wallace was among the first to volunteer. 3 days after the Binba ambush, Warrant Officer Ron Ston stood in the Nui Dat briefing room explaining what the Australians had been doing all along. Captain Wallace sat in the front row, taking notes for the first time in years. Ston laid 2 rifles on the table. An American M16, 39 inches from buttstock to muzzle. His modified L1A1, 33 inches total length. Your M16 is this long, Ston said, his Australian accent somehow making the technical briefing feel conversational. In thick jungle, you're moving through vegetation every meter. Every time this barrel touches a branch, it makes noise. Every time you push through bamboo, 39 inches of metal scrape against it. He gestured to his shortened rifle. 6 inches doesn't sound like much. But we counted once over 200 contact points in a 100-meter movement through dense jungle. We've cut that by 40%, maybe 50%, because the shorter barrel means we can move it vertically more often, away from vegetation instead of through it. A Green Beret captain in the third row raised his hand. But you're losing muzzle velocity. You're losing accuracy past 200 meters. Correct, Ston said without defensiveness. We've lost about 150 feet per second. Our effective range is now 250 meters instead of 300. He paused, letting the question hang in the air. How many contacts in jungle terrain happen past 250 meters? The room was silent. Everyone knew the answer. Almost none. Most contacts happened within 50 meters. Many within 20. The VC and NVA weren't standing in open fields. We've optimized for the environment we're actually fighting in, Ston continued, not the environment we wish we were fighting in. He pulled out a sound meter and began the acoustic breakdown that would fundamentally change how American Special Forces thought about jungle warfare. American equipment at walking speed generated approximately 35 decibels, audible to trained ears at 400 meters in a quiet jungle. Australian gear, through meticulous modification, generated roughly 15 decibels, audible at perhaps 75 meters. The PRC-25 radio's squelch break alone registered at 40 decibels, detectable at 200 meters. That difference, Ston said, pointing at the numbers he'd written on the board, means the VC hears you at 400 meters instead of 75. In an environment where visibility is 30 meters, that's the difference between being hunted and being invisible. He demonstrated the walking technique. American soldiers stepped bala-foot first, then heel natural movement on hard surfaces, taught in every infantry school. The Australians stepped heel first, feeling for twigs and debris before committing their weight, then rolling the foot down. Slower, painfully slower, but silent. The equipment philosophy extended to everything. No metal canteen cups, they rang when touched. Cloth tape over every metal surface. No dog tags that could clink together. Ammunition carried in canvas pouches, not metal. One radio per 5-man patrol, and they rarely used it. Our mission is reconnaissance, not engagement, Ston explained. We find the enemy, count him, photograph him, report his position. And we never let him know we're there. The statistics backed him up. Between April and June 1968, Australian SAS patrols completed 87% of their reconnaissance missions successfully, compared to the American average of 43%. Only 12% of Australian contacts were initiated by the enemy, compared to the American average of 68%. 2 weeks later, an American sergeant named Rodriguez tried the Australian method on a reconnaissance patrol. He moved at 30 meters per hour, used the heel roll step Ston had demonstrated, taped every metal surface on his equipment. He got within 8 meters of a VC command post. 8 meters, close enough to hear them arguing about American patrol patterns. He photographed documents through a window with a telephoto lens. When he reported back, Wallace pulled him aside after the debriefing. "That's impossible." Rodriguez smiled, the expression of a man who'd seen something that changed his understanding of what possible meant. "That's what I thought too, sir." You would think American Special Forces would have jumped at the opportunity. The Australians were proving, operation after operation, that their methods worked. Their kill ratios were extraordinary. Their casualty rates were a fraction of American numbers. But military culture is more complicated than simple effectiveness. The resistance came from multiple directions. First, there was equipment politics. The U.S. Army had spent millions developing and procuring the M16. Suggesting that soldiers should take hacksaws to their rifles was essentially suggesting that the entire procurement system had made a fundamental mistake. In the military, admitting mistakes at that level was complicated, expensive, and career-ending. Second, there was doctrine. American infantry doctrine had been refined over decades, emphasizing mobility and firepower. The idea that slower was better, that less ammunition was an advantage, that avoiding contact was preferable to winning contact, these concepts contradicted everything the Army had taught since World War II. Third, and this is where it gets uncomfortable, there was pride. American Special Forces were the best in the world. Everyone knew it. The idea that they needed to learn from a smaller ally, from soldiers who carried modified rifles and moved at a glacial pace, was difficult for some operators to accept. Major Robert Howard, a Medal of Honor recipient who served with SOG, later reflected on this tension with characteristic honesty. "We were trained that Americans win through superior firepower and aggressive action." The Australian approach felt passive. It felt like we were hiding instead of fighting. It took me a long time to understand that invisibility is its own form of superiority. General Abrams's cross-training program became a careful dance. Some units embraced it immediately. SOG's Command and Control North sent an entire team to train with 3 squadron. They came back converts, immediately modifying their tactics and equipment. Other units refused outright. "We don't need to learn to be slow," one team leader reportedly said, his voice carrying the weight of professional pride that would cost lives before it broke. But slowly, organically, change began happening from the bottom up. Some SOG teams in I Corps began moving slower. Equipment was taped more carefully. In areas where command oversight was limited, soldiers started making unauthorized modifications, removing flash suppressors, shortening stocks, anything to reduce their weapons profile. By late 1968, an unofficial Australian method was being taught at the SOG training site at Long Tan. Not formally. It wasn't in any manual. But veteran team leaders were passing on techniques to new arrivals: how to move silently, how to position ambushes by predicting enemy movement rather than reacting to it, and how to use patience as a weapon. The proof accumulated in ways that couldn't be dismissed. Between June and December 1968, Australian SAS patrols in Phu Thai province recorded 403 enemy killed versus 3 Australian fatalities, a 134 to 1 kill ratio that was statistically unprecedented in modern warfare. American units that had adopted Australian tactics were showing improvement too. One SOG company that implemented slower movement and extreme noise discipline saw their casualty rate drop 40% over 6 months, while their successful intelligence gathering increased. The modified rifles remained controversial. The U.S. Army never officially sanctioned cutting down M16s, and soldiers caught doing it could theoretically face equipment damage charges. But in the field, many team leaders looked the other way. Survival rates didn't lie. Then came Operation Portsea in July 1968, the moment that would force even the most stubborn commanders to admit the Australians were right. Operation Portsea was supposed to be a demonstration of Allied cooperation. Australian and American forces would conduct parallel operations in the Long High Hills, a notorious Viet Cong stronghold, with the goal of locating and destroying enemy supply caches. 2 patrols, same objective area, different approaches. It became something else entirely, the ultimate comparison that would settle the debate once and for all. Sidewinder Patrol was a 6-man SOG team with an excellent combat record. They had volunteered for the joint operation specifically to prove that American tactics could be just as effective as Australian methods when properly executed. Pride motivated them as much as the mission. They inserted on July 18 at 0900 hours and moved aggressively toward the objective, a suspected supply cache in a cave complex, coordinates already identified through signals intelligence. They pushed hard, moving at 120 meters per hour, knowing exactly where they needed to go. By 1300 hours, 4 hours after insertion, they reached the cave complex. Empty. Worse than empty, freshly abandoned. The cooking fires still held warmth. Equipment had been scattered in obvious haste. Someone had removed supplies within the last few hours, maybe less. The VC had known they were coming. Sidewinder set up a defensive perimeter and radioed for instructions. The decision came back quickly: extract. The element of surprise was gone. Staying in the area risked walking into a prepared ambush. They moved to the extraction point along a different route, using proper tactical spacing and overwatch. At 1545 hours, they were ambushed anyway. 2 men wounded, 1 seriously. The team fought their way out with helicopter gunship support, but the mission was a complete failure. 0 intelligence. 0 enemy supplies destroyed. 2 casualties. The area was compromised. Walleye Patrol, meanwhile, had inserted 30 minutes after Sidewinder with a different approach. 5 men under Corporal Jack Kelly, moving at their typical glacial pace. For hours after insertion, they had covered less than 400 meters. But they had noticed something. Fresh boot prints crossing their route, multiple individuals moving quickly, within the last 2 hours. Instead of continuing to the objective coordinates they'd been given, Kelly made a decision. He followed the tracks. For 6 hours, the Walleye Patrol tracked the Viet Cong. Not following directly on their trail, that's how you walk into ambushes, but paralleling it, using the VC's own noise as cover for their movement. The enemy was moving quickly, confident they'd evaded the American patrol, unaware they were being hunted. At 1900 hours, Walleye found what the VC had been carrying from the original cave complex. A new supply cache, hastily concealed in a different location, guarded by only 4 VC who clearly thought they were safe. Kelly observed for 90 minutes. Photographed the cache. Counted supplies. and discovered this wasn't just a supply depot, it was a medical station with documents indicating it served multiple VC units across the region. Intelligence gold. At 20:30 hours, Kelly made the first and only radio transmission of the mission, providing the new coordinates. The cache was destroyed by an airstrike at 2100 hours. The documents recovered from the site led to 3 more operations over the following weeks that systematically dismantled an entire VC supply network. The comparison was stark. One patrol had found nothing and took casualties. The other had found a more valuable target than originally briefed and taken 0 casualties. The after-action report reached General Abrams's desk within 48 hours. His response was 2 words: "Tell me everything." The immediate impact was subtle. MACV didn't issue orders mandating Australian tactics. You can't simply override decades of doctrine with a memo. But something more organic happened, spreading through the special operations community like fire through dry grass. No orders came down from MACV headquarters mandating Australian tactics. The Army doesn't work that way. You can't simply override decades of doctrine, millions of dollars in procurement decisions, and institutional pride with a memo. But what happened instead was more powerful change from the bottom up, spreading through the special operations community one convert at a time. Individual units started experimenting. SOG teams in I Corps began moving slower, much slower, on certain operations. Equipment was being taped more carefully, with attention to every possible noise source. In areas where command oversight was limited, and in Vietnam, many operational areas had very limited oversight, soldiers started making modifications that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. At the Long Ton training site, veteran team leaders who'd operated alongside the Australians were teaching techniques that appeared in no manual. The Australian method was being passed from team leader to team leader like contraband, shared in the barracks and over beers, never officially acknowledged but increasingly practiced. The modified weapons remained technically unauthorized. Soldiers caught cutting down their rifles could face equipment damage charges. But in the field, many officers looked the other way. When a team came back with perfect intelligence and 0 casualties carrying modified weapons, what commander was going to write them up? Field effectiveness was trumping regulations in ways that would have been impossible in a peacetime army. The statistics were becoming impossible to ignore. The Australian SAS 134-1 kill ratio, 403 enemy killed versus 3 Australian Kia over a 6-month period, was unprecedented. But more importantly, American units that had adopted Australian tactics were showing measurable improvement. A 40% reduction in casualty rates. Mission success rates climbed from the low 40s to the high 60s percentage-wise. Intelligence gathering wasn't just increasing in quantity, it was improving in quality. Captain Jim Wallace's personal journey mirrored the broader transformation. From dismissive skeptic watching Australians unload butchered rifles, to confused observers asking how the hell did they get that close, to reluctant students taking notes in the front row, to true believer and finally vocal advocate. By late 1968, Wallace was spending as much time teaching Australian techniques as conducting operations. "They taught me the most expensive lesson of my career," he told a room of new SOG operators in November 1968. "That sometimes the people you think are idiots are the ones who will save your life." The controversy was never fully resolved. Modified rifles were never officially sanctioned. The possibility of equipment damage charges remained on the books. But survival rates don't lie, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the culture was shifting beneath the surface of official doctrine. Techniques were being documented informally, not in field manuals, but in after-action reports that emphasized what worked. The next generation of special operators was learning from survivors who'd seen both methods and knew which one brought them home. The philosophy was changing even as the official doctrine remained frozen in Cold War-era assumptions about firepower and mobility. The expensive lesson was being paid forward, one patrol at a time, one modified rifle at a time, one heel roll step at a time through jungles that punished speed and rewarded patience. After the war ended and enough time had passed for honest assessment, the legacy would become clearer and vindicate everything the Australians had taught with their butchered rifles and glacial movements through the jungle. In the 1980s, when the US military began developing new special operations doctrine after Vietnam, Australian techniques were formally incorporated into training programs. The Ranger Handbook started including sections on environmental adaptation that were, in some cases, word-for-word descriptions of Australian SAS methods. SEAL team training incorporated Australian-style tracking and counter-tracking. Delta Force operators trained regularly with their SASR counterparts, learning the patience-based approach to reconnaissance that had seemed so foreign 2 decades earlier. The M4 carbine, with its 14.5-inch barrel compared to the M16's 20 inches, became standard issue for U.S. Special Operations Forces. It was a physical manifestation of lessons learned in Vietnamese jungles, shorter, more maneuverable, optimized for the environments where special operators actually fought rather than the environments doctrine assumed they would fight in. Modern American Special Operations Forces now teach techniques that would have been called crazy in 1968. Extreme noise discipline. Modified weapons for specific environments. Movement speeds that prioritize invisibility over tactical pace. The philosophy had shifted from firepower and aggression to information control and patience. Lieutenant Colonel David Hackworth, one of the most decorated American officers in Vietnam, later wrote, "The Australians taught us something we should have known from the beginning. In guerrilla warfare, the side that controls information wins. Being invisible is more valuable than being deadly. Being patient is more powerful than being aggressive." Fort Bragg, North Carolina. 1989, 21 years after watching Australian SAS soldiers unload their gear at Nui Dat Base, Colonel Jim Wallace stood in front of a classroom teaching jungle warfare doctrine to a new generation of Special Forces operators. He held up 2 rifles. An M16 with a 20-inch barrel. An M4 carbine with a 14.5-inch barrel. This shorter weapon, Wallace told the class, was developed because of lessons learned in Vietnam. Specifically, from Australian SAS operators who understood something we didn't. In jungle warfare, invisibility matters more than firepower. A student in the second row raised his hand. "Sir, did you serve with the Australians?" Wallace smiled. It was a complicated expression that held 20 years of memories. Python Patrol getting torn apart while Ferret Patrol brought back perfect intelligence. Sergeant Peters lay motionless for 7 hours with a bull ant biting his leg. Corporal Kelly tracked VC for 6 hours without firing a shot. His own stubborn certainty that the Australians were doing everything wrong, right up until the moment he realized they were doing everything right. "I did," Wallace said. "And they taught me the most expensive lesson of my career, that sometimes the people you think are idiots are the ones who will save your life." He paused, looking at the faces of young operators who would deploy to jungles and mountains and deserts around the world, carrying weapons and doctrine shaped by lessons learned decades before. Those modified rifles looked like they'd been butchered in a garage. And in a way, they had been. But those Australians understood something fundamental: the best weapon isn't always the newest technology or the heaviest firepower. Sometimes it's a philosophy. Wallace set down the rifles. In certain environments, invisibility matters more than lethality. Patience matters more than aggression. Being quiet matters more than being quick. The Australians knew that in 1968. It took us 3 months and too many casualties to learn it. He looked at each student, letting the weight of what he was saying settle. Don't make the same mistake we did. Don't assume that someone doing things differently is doing them wrong. Sometimes they're just solving a problem you haven't figured out yet. The classroom was silent. Then the students picked up their weapons and headed for the training range, moving slowly, deliberately, practicing techniques learned from 120 Australians with cut-down rifles who operated in jungles half a world away decades before. The Green Berets who mocked those rifles in 1968 had learned their lesson the hard way. The ones who survived, anyway. But because of them, because of their willingness to eventually admit they were wrong, to learn from allies they'd dismissed, to change doctrine that had cost too many lives, the next generation didn't have to learn it the same way. Young operators moved through the training jungle, silent and invisible, carrying lessons paid for in blood by men who learned too late that the idiots had the answer all along.